Okay,
very late night for me, so I'm like way behind schedule this morning.
I'm sure you are.
So I'm gonna get some water. I gotta get my coffee. I'm like it was.
Okay, okay, we thought you were still out of town.
I'm still listening. I'm just in my kitchen doing my thing. Forgive me.
Okay, okay, yeah, okay. So now,
Whatever, Rabbi.
Safra Tava, we find later that when they entered into the Teivah, it says Noach and his sons and his wife and his daughters-in-law. So from there we see that they were not permitted in procreation in the Teivah. When they came out of the Teivah after a year, it says Noach and his wife and his son and his wives. But during that 12-month period, while the Great Flood was going on, they were not permitted. So the question is, why not? Why were they permitted? So Rashi cites Chazal, because when the world, well, that's a question, like this. The Gemara tells us when the world is in a state of suffering, on a world level, person is not permitted to cohabit. Where do we learn this from? You learn it from Yosef. Because Yosef HaTzadik, the Torah tells us that after he married Osnas Bas Potifera, the Torah makes it a point, he had two sons, two children, before the famine. Before the famine. So the Gemara asks, why does it have to tell us it was before the famine? Does it make a difference before the famine, after the famine? So from here we learn that when the world is in a state of suffering, one is not permitted to engage in procreation. That's what we learn from Yosef. So I asked the question, what do we have to wait for Yosef? One we learn from the Great Flood. The world is in a state of suffering. That's the reason why you're not permitted, as it says, Noach and his sons went in separately, and his wife and his daughters all went separately. So you see from there, when the world is in a state of destruction or suffering, you're not permitted to cohabit. What do we have to learn from Yosef? That's the question I asked. So what we had once discussed is this. From this Great Flood, it's not simple. That's the understanding. Why? Because I could tell you this. Once it began, the Mabul began, and they went into the ark, all creation was contained in that table. Outside the table, what existed outside the table? What existed outside the table was what existed at the very beginning of creation, as the Torah describes, even before light came into existence. It says it was tovavo, choshech al pnei tom, v'ruach elokim rachev sal pnei hamoyim. That was the state of affairs in the world outside the table. The world was covered with water. The highest mountain had 15 amos of water above it. The luminaries didn't function. There was no life outside of the table. Outside the ark, whatever was in the table. So for all intents and purposes, Hashem ceased to create. The act of creation ceased the moment the Great Flood started. Man's and the animals' semblance of comparison to Hashem to be creative is the act of procreation. The act of cohabitation is called an act of procreation because it's the closest thing to ex nihilo. That's what it is. When Hashem doesn't create existence, the creative process is not in effect. So I'd say the reason why they weren't permitted was for that reason, because everything stopped at that moment. When they came out, creation started over again. That was the very beginning of creation, because we find, as I pointed out, which we'll see later, that there's a replication of the beginning of creation when Noah came out of the Teivah. As Adam had brought korbanos on the first day of his creation, when he was created, Noach brought korbanos. As Adam had 3 sons, Noach had 3 sons. As Adam's 3 sons, one was a tzaddik, one was a rasha, one was middle of the road, Noach had 3 sons, tzaddik, rasha, middle of the road. We find the water covered 15 amos above the mountains, the highest mountain peak. When did Noach first send out the bird? To see whether the water started to recede to the point that maybe creation is coming back into reality. He waited 40 days after the highest peak of the mountain was seen. He waited 40 days. And then he sent out the bird. He sent out the raven. When he saw the peak of the mount showed itself, that's the beginning of the what? Of existence coming back into existence. At 40 days is the period of what? Of from conception till life is a 40-day period. Therefore, he waited 40 days. We find that Noach's state of affairs in the Teivah, out Teivah, is literally a replication of creation. So I would say the reason why they weren't permitted to cohabit, to be involved in the procreative process, which was as Hashem is not in the creative mode. Mankind, who's B'Tselem Elokim, who's an image of God, he's not permitted to be in the creative mode. Once Hashem goes back into creative mode, because existence is ready to start over again, now Noach and his children and all species that could be procreate are permitted to procreate. It tells us that Timoli Horitz Chomos. The land was rife with thievery, Chomos. So over here, the Baal Turba says Chomos b'Gematria Mei Noach. Chomos is numerically the same numerical as Mei Noach, the waters of Noach, which are the flood waters. Then he says Chomos b'Gematria Gehenim. Gehenim and Chomos are the same Gematria. Malame Shebrosa Nidonu. Right. The Gemara tells us that the water of the great flood, it was hot, it was sulfuric. As a result of everything in the water, totally dissolved. That's why there was no trace of anything that was in existence. Everything was stripped bare due to the hot sulfuric water. So Gemara asks a question. In Zvochim, the Teivah was made of wood. So if it was made of wood, the Teivah should have disintegrated due to the hot sulfuric water. And also, Og Mel Chaboshon, Og, was the only person who was from pre-flood. Gemara tells us he hung on to the Teivah. And there was one of the species, which was called the Re'im. The Re'im also was outside the Teivah. It's a very large species. So the Gemara says, how did they survive? If they were hanging on to the outside Teivah, they had their mouths in the Teivah because the air outside the Teivah was all toxic, that everything totally perished. If you inhaled that air, so how did they survive? So the Gemara says that the water surrounding the Teivah was cold water. It's only the water beyond the Teivah, that's where the water was sulfuric. But where the Teivah actually sat, that water was not sulfuric. Therefore, that's why the Teivah didn't disintegrate. Okay? What about the fish? The fish survived the great flood. Because we see later when it says, when the flood came, it says, Kol Asher b'charov mesu. All that was on the dry land died. So from there, the Gemara says the inference is, but was not on dry land, like the fish which are in the water, they did not die. So Gemara asks, why did they die? I mean, if the water is sulfuric, they should have died. So Gemara gives one of two answers. Either the Gemara says that the fish went to the depths of the sea, and therefore the water there was not, therefore they were able to survive, or the flood waters did not cover Eretz Yisrael. So all the fish, they swam towards Eretz Yisrael. That's why they were able to survive. The water around Eretz Yisrael was not sulfuric. Somewhere says, so why humanity in Eretz Yisrael, all living species, so they should have survived if the flood waters didn't cover Eretz Yisrael? So our answer is that the air was so toxic that if you would inhale that air, you would die. So therefore, anything on the dry land that was exposed to the atmosphere perished for that reason. But the fish that were in the water, and the water being not hot and sulfuric, that's why the fish were able to survive. That's one of the two answers which the Gemara gives. We're holding Pasuk Yud Gimel. V'yomer Elokim leNoach. Again, Elokim is the attribute of justice. Kates kol bosa bo lefonai. The end of all flesh has come before me. Because God says, I will give them 120 years. And if they don't turn around in 120 years, the world comes to an end. Ki mola oretz chamos mipneim. So Rashi cites the Gemara Sanhedrin, lo nechtam gzadinum el chamos. The last nail in the coffin was because of the sin of thievery. I mean, person fails in other levels, idolatry, adultery, bestiality, incest, whatever it is. But chamos, where you can't even live with one another because you don't respect one another's rights, you steal, it's rife with thievery. Hashem says, this is what? This is like the sword that broke the camel's back. Lo nechtach zadima elo ala gezel. V'ni mashchisom es oretz. I will destroy them es oretz. So Rashi brings the famous Chazal that 3 tvachim of the earth was stripped off the earth. We always say that 3 tvachim is lovud, correct? If you have anything within 3 tvachim to the ground, it's like on the ground. But if it's 3 tvachim, it's separated. 3 tvachim into the earth, because it was exposed to mankind's behavior, was absorbed. All the impurity of man's behavior affected that level of existence. Therefore, that level of existence, which was exposed to mankind's perverted behavior, evil behavior, had to also go into the oblivion, had to be stripped. So 3 tvachim of the earth was stripped off the surface to purify the world. That's ini mashchisa min ha'oretz. From the oretz, Rashi says over here, Davrache es oretz im oretz shav gibel tvachim shel omek habachrisha nimuchov nitashushu. The 3 tvachim, the blade of the plow that goes into the ground, 3 tvachim, that earth was also stripped. It's interesting. Just thinking. It never occurred to me. You should say, like I said, 3 tvachim is lavud. So anything within 3 tvachim has relevance to the human being. Rashi doesn't say that. He's citing the Midrash. Shav gimel tvachim shel omek hamachrisha. 3 tvachim, which is the depth of the blade of the plow that goes into the ground, that also dissolved and actually was destroyed. What do I say? 3 tvachim. Why the depth of the machrisha? Because the depth of the charisha, what's plowing? You turn over the earth. That means that earth within 3 tvachim of the ground is turned over. That means that earth, even though it's within it, that was exposed to man. That was surface. That's omek habachrisha. Man's relevance to that, it goes that deep into the ground. How does he have relevance more than the surface? The answer is because that's the plow. The whole world was an agricultural society. That means all the ground of the world was plowed. So if it was plowed, that means man, the earth within 3 tvachim of the earth, it's like we speak of virgin soil. Anything below that was considered virgin soil. It wasn't affected. But within 3 tvachim, because it was turned over, that was exposed to mankind's behavior. Therefore, it had to be destroyed. That is that the straw that broke the camel's back was thievery. People didn't respect one another's existence, even on a humanistic level. The Cheskel tells us, the Cheskel Hanavi tells us that why was Sodom destroyed? Although the Torah says, Ron v'chatom l'Hashem eod. Because they openly, deliberately defied Hashem, that's why Hashem destroyed them. But the Gemara, Cheskel says, because lo noslu yad lo'oni, they did not extend their hand to the poor man. They didn't give charity. Charity in Chesed, in Sodom, was a capital crime. If you did Chesed, it was punished by death. That was Sodom. So again, we're talking about a basic natural inclination in a human being to have some sense of compassion for your fellow human being, they didn't have. And the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, people have to live with their conscience. A person would come to Sodom to try to raise money for himself. So every person in Sodom, they had an agreement, everybody gives a gold coin to the poor man. And they engrave their name on the coin. Each person who gives the coin, he graves his name. So if the poor person comes and he sees it's a windfall here, what does he do? He starts filling up a sack with these gold coins, and it comes to the end of the day, he's carrying this heavy sack of coins, and he hasn't eaten or drunk all day, and he feels he's passing out, but he has all this money. He goes into a home, he says, could you give me some food or drink? I feel I'm passing out, I'm dying. He said, we're sorry. Here we give money, we don't give food or drink. You have to go outside the outskirts, out of Sodom to purchase your food and your water. Otherwise, we give charity. We don't give food or drink. What would he? The man's dragging this heavy sack of gold coins. As he gets to the edge of the city, he drops. He dies. Everybody goes and they reclaim their coins because each coin is identified because they have their signature or their initial on the coin. And this repeats itself continuously. So these people deluding themselves, look, we gave gold, who gives gold coins? And this is how they live with their conscience. The same idea. That was the straw that broke the camel's back. But it says, adultery, everything under the sun they violated. But the basic sense of humanity, the way you should behave, they deluded themselves, they can live with their conscience. You do A through Z, fine. So if a person is only stealing, but at least you're intact regarding everything else. But if everything else has really come to an end, you have to have a saving grace. You don't even have the basic saving grace of humanity. If that's the case, Hashem says, I'm pulling the plug on this whole system. Shlomo tells us in Mishlei, Soni matonis yichya. The one who despises taking gifts, he will live. So the Malbim explains why Soni matonis yichya. Everything is to emulate Hashem. It's like the Maral says, I mentioned many times the Maral. If you dovik b'Hashem, if you cleave to Hashem, chaim kulchem hayom. Why? Because what's the source of all life? Hashem. Everything emanates from Him. So if you attach yourself to the source, chaim kulchem hayom. That's the meaning of the pasuk. So Malbim says that Hashem is a nosei, not a lokech. God gives, God never takes. God's a giver, He's never a taker. So if you emulate Hashem, that you take on His profile to give, not to take. So therefore, Soni matonos, if you don't take even a gift, you only give, you're not a taker, yichya, you will live. That's the understanding. So what is the profile? Man was created Tzelem Elokim. But the all-encompassing profile, Hashem is a giver. But even the giver, you're not even a giver. You failed at every level. Adultery, idolatry, everything else under the sun. Even menachai, eating animal, the limb from a living animal, whatever you're doing, everything under the sun. But now you don't even resemble God to any degree. Not only do you take in a situation where the other person is agreeable to give, you take forcibly from the other person. That's chomos, that's thievery. This has no semblance to Tzelem Elokim. It has no semblance to Tzelem Elokim. Hashem says it's over. Therefore, that was the last nail in the coffin. Make for yourself a Teivah, a box made of gopher wood. Kinim tases a Teivah. You should make this box, should be made with cubicles, rooms, kinema cubicles. And it should be coated from the inside and the outside with pitch. You have to waterproof it. You're waterproofing this box so the water should not penetrate. Okay. Let's take a look at Rashi. Asla Tevas. Harbi Revach Hatzola Lefonov. God has many solutions how to deal with a problem. He could create an island of refuge for whatever had to be saved without creating this Teivah. This is a project he worked on for 120 years, busy building this. The wood building continuous. He was building these cubicles for 120 years. Why did he burden him with this? That people should see Noach engaged in this project for 120 years, the Sholin also. And they would ask him, Noach was a world-renowned personality. He came from the most prestigious family. As I said, he invented the plow. So he changed the agriculture of the world. It was survivable. It made it easy for people. So when people would see him engaged in this project for 120 years, show him, Mazos Loch, they said, no, what are you doing? He says, in the future, Hashem will bring a flood on the world. Maybe by hearing ultimately that there's going to be a very serious consequence to the behavior, they'll do tshuva. So it was to get the attention of the world. That was the focal point to begin the dialogue, the discussion of tshuva. What is this man doing? He's not a fool. But afterwards, what did it become? It was known as it became Noach's folly. That's what it was. Like it was known, the Panama Canal originally was known as Clinton's folly. It's a joke. What are you doing? Wasting your time. So the Midrash tells us that after a while, Noach's discussion and dialogue fell on deaf ears. It became like a joke. Every year at the anniversary of starting this project, all humanity would gather around Noach and they say, Noach, so what's happening? What's this all about? He says, and you repeat verbatim every time, if you people don't change your ways, God will bring a flood on this world. You will all be destroyed. And there'll be no trace of this existence. And they would say to Noach, you know something? If God's going to bring a flood on this world, that's on you and your family, not on us. Not on us. And this will repeat itself year in and year out until finally it started to rain, which we will discuss. The rain started to come now. But that, it should be the focal point of discussion. That's why he built the Teivah, but we'll see even more than that. Why did he choose? The wood was called gopher wood. Gopher. Take a look at Rashi. Atze gopher, kach shmo. V'loma means that. Why of this particular species of wood? Al shem gofris shenigzar aleim limochas bo. Right, we say fire and brimstone. What's gopris? Gopris is sulfur. The wood alluded to sulfur, that the water is going to be sulfuric. It's going to be sulfuric, and therefore everything's going to totally disintegrate in the water. Kinim, madurim. Kinim, targiminim, madurim, mean little domiciles. Every species in the Teivah had its own privacy. No two species were in the same location. Could you imagine? Firstly, you can see in a moment, what was the dimension of the Teivah? Let's see. The length was 300 amos, cubits. 50 wide. There's a question of how large is an amo. Is it 18 inches, 2 feet, 22 inches, whatever it is. Maximum the Teivah was 600 feet long, 100 feet wide, and 60 feet high. Now, what went into the Teivah? Every living species, domesticated, undomesticated, birds, insects, reptiles. Is it possible to fit into such a limited location? It was a miracle. It's like, they just kept going through that door and just kept going in. And there was a capacity which unlimited. How's it possible? The answer, it was a miracle. Of course it was a miracle. Like the Gemara tells us, the Beis Hamikdash on Yom Kippur, all the people were there, Omdim Tzufim, Mushtachim Revochim. They stood, they were pressed together when they heard the name of Hashem being pronounced by the Kohen Gadol. They prostrated themselves, and there was enough room for them to be fully prostrated. You understand? The walls didn't expand. I mean, how did it happen? The answer is because although the Beis Hamikdash was a physical entity, but its innate value, what it was spiritual. Within spiritual, there's no such thing as limitation. The Teivah itself had no limitation. But it was that why Hashem chose those dimensions, 60 by 50 by 30. Each one is symbolic of something. But factually, it was a spiritual entity. Anything spiritual has no limitation. Therefore, everything could go in there. But it was large enough that it should be a focal point that certain things don't dawn on people. And the Ramban makes it a point here. If Hashem wanted him to go into a matchbox, there's nothing beyond Hashem's capacity. He could do it. But there will be so blatantly clear, a miracle's happening over here. Here they went through the front door. But now you have a new question. But based on the dimension, it's no way it can contain all this. No, we didn't think about that. We didn't think about that. What's the first step to tshuva? Hakor sachet. You have to realize that you did something wrong. If you believe you did nothing wrong, the tshuva process can't even begin. When you realize you did something wrong, and now you realize you have to write it and make a correction. Now, how do you start writing it? But if you believe that you live in your ivory tower and you're totally oblivious to everything, this man is not changing. Same idea. You have to have some degree of recognition. He's entering into dialogue. We ask him a question. No, what are you doing here? You're not a shipbuilder. You're a holy man. You're this, you're that. What's this all about? Okay, that was the basis to get involved in this discussion.